Neil, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. And I wanted to start by saying something about the debate in Norway. And it seems like the majority of the public debate we have on technology is still very much either a boring argument about should we have it or should we not have it, with very polarized views. And usually the most polarized persons you could get in a studio to debate it. Or there are these quite superficial discussions about what specific technologies we should have. For example, we have large debates about if we should invest in one-to-one access to iPads or if one-to-one access to Chromebooks should be better. So the debates tend to be quite superficial and not really address the big picture. But I know that you, on the other hand, are quite concerned with the larger picture. And I have a quote that you have given somewhere else that I like a lot, where you say that educational technology is a matter of values and choosing what sort of schools and society we want to live in. And that is definitely a bigger picture perspective. So could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks ever so much for talking. I'm very excited to talk to you as well, Mart. I've liked your work a lot. And thanks for the invitation, Marianne. I think we can't talk about being for or against technology anymore. Technology's here. So I think I always like to say it's a bit like food or oxygen. You can't be for or against it, but you can have opinions on the quality or the type of food or oxygen or technology. So it's not a case of being for or against, but it's kind of a question of what type of education we want. And so I think the point I was making when I was arguing that it's actually about the wider picture is it's not really about the technology. So if you take a socio-technical perspective, you're actually interested in how technology comes together with society, with schools, with economy, with culture, and everything is mixed together. So it's not really a choice of which app to buy or which device, or whether we have one device per student or two devices per student. It's much more a question about what we want to do with the technology and what we think the technology will do to us. And so this idea of what education would be like is a really good place to start. What kind of schools do we want? What kind of education do we value? And then technology often comes along as the last part of the puzzle. So a lot of the debates about educational technology are actually debates about education and are debates about schools. And there are debates we've been having for decades, if not centuries. So in some ways, we need to move our attention away from the shiny new technology and go back to kind of basic questions. What do we want education to be for? What do we want education to be like?
Yeah, I very much agree. And I have read a lot of your work, and I see that I think we both agree that technology can also be very good for education in certain cases, and that it can lead to better learning and more motivation. And that's definitely possible, but it depends a lot on the quality of the implementation as well, and if you have clear goals. But there is a lot of research, and some of it stems from us, but from our different parts of the globe. There is an overwhelming amount of research showing that even when you have some purpose or some ambition to implement one-to-one technology, especially, a lot of unanticipated things happen, and it's really difficult to implement technology well. And I think a lot of teachers and school leaders who are listening to this would agree that it's quite complicated to do it. Do you have any thoughts on what is making it so difficult for schools to do this successfully?
Oh, look, I mean, one of the things I would say is that one size never fits all. So there's no magic solution to how you should be doing technology. Technology is a very kind of local thing. So what works in one class may not work in another class. What works in one school may not work in another school. And so if people are looking for ways to use technology well, I'd always advise them to look at their own practice, talk to their own colleagues, talk to teachers that are in similar schools. Don't be looking at research for the answer. Researchers shouldn't be or can't answer the question of how do you best use technology. And a lot of technology use in classrooms, like everything in classrooms, is just really messy. It has to be improvised. There's no kind of right way of doing it. Often we're making it up as we go along. And every teacher coming to the conference, every teacher watching this will have experiences of when technology's worked well and when it hasn't. And so in some ways, we shouldn't be putting pressure on teachers to be, having some kind of perfect way of using technology all of the time. It's just like everything else in life, some good, some bad. I mean, there are things that you can do to kind of hopefully have a good time, but you can never guarantee good uses of technology. And I think the research can be a little bit of distraction. I mean, I'm a researcher. I've been researching classrooms for 25 years now, but I wouldn't say research is the place to go to look for how to get practical tips to use technology. So academic research is a very positive project. A lot of educational researchers want to prove that technology is a good thing. They want to show how it could be used, how it should be used. It's very kind of forward-looking and very kind of best case scenario. And so I think the distinction I like to make in my own research is I'm not really interested in the state of the art. I'm interested in the state of the actual, what actually takes place in a real life classroom. And that's where it gets really, really messy. And it's not messy in a bad way. It's just messy in every type of way. And I'm really interested where you find unexpected or surprising positive uses, or, you know, just interesting accidents. So it's not a negative approach, but I think hopefully it's a more realistic approach.
Yeah. And I agree with you that if you look for research, I mean, if you go to Google Scholar and try to find what works, in general, it might not work for you as a teacher. And I think all teachers have experienced that on almost all aspects of educational research, actually, because it is really hard to find something that fits everyone. But I think it's interesting that here in Norway now we have a new curricula. And so a lot of schools are buying new stuff for their schools, including a lot of digital platform. And this is more a comment than a question, but I think it's interesting that a lot of the big publishers that are trying to sell this technology, what they sell is actually the magical solution, because they do claim to have a product that fits everyone and that will always make instruction better. So that is a problem, but I think that's kind of a worldwide problem.
Well, and also it's a technology-wide problem. So this idea of solutionism or techno-solutionism is ingrained in kind of how technology is sold to us in every aspect of our life. And it's interesting to actually kind of unpack the solutions that are being sold to you, and also the problems that are, and it's really interesting to think about what problem is actually being pitched and who it's a problem for as well. And I think as soon as you start asking those questions, you can see a lot of education technology, the main customers are either the principals or the IT director, then very rarely the teacher, and the customer, the end customer or the end user is never the student.
Never.
And so a lot of these solutions and a lot of these products are configured to be sold to the person who's holding the checkbook or actually has the reins to the account. And their priorities are going to be very different to a classroom teacher. So I'm always super skeptical of anyone trying to sell me anything, but also trying to unpack the values behind why do they think this is a problem and why do they think technology is a solution. And I think, as I was getting at before, technology can be part of a solution, but it's always the end part. The solutions to most educational problems are not technical, they're social. And then we have to tackle the social issues first, and the pedagogical issues and everything else, and then maybe technology can support those other things. But it's never on its own a magic bullet or all of these other phrases. If it was that easy, I'd be not working as an academic. I'd be selling you my own solution.
Of course. Yeah, and I think it's an interesting thing, this tension between who gets to decide what technology actually is going into each individual teacher's classroom, because it's very seldom, for structural reasons, it's very seldom the teachers themselves. And in Norway, teachers have great autonomy, and we have this thing called metodefrihet, which all the teachers are very happy about, because it literally means that if you're the teacher for this particular class, you are the one that is going to make the choices about how they should be taught, not what, because that's in a national curriculum, but how they should get their instruction and what kind of activities they should do and what learning experience. That's always up to the teacher. So that actually means that no politician or no educational researchers like us, or not even the principal, can instruct on how the teaching should happen. But I'm quite concerned about that aspect of Norwegian teachers' rights and autonomy, because I think the minute you say that everybody's going to use, for example, an Apple iPad from the 1st grade to the 7th grade, you have actually intervened in how they're going to teach as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to say there. I mean, similarly in Australia and in most countries, there's kind of a 2-tier system going on in schools. So you have the official technologies, So the iPads, as you say, or you might have a learning management system that everyone has to use. But then under the radar, you have most teachers just downloading apps that they fancy to use, or maybe bringing in their own software. And it's a little bit like the Wild West, that there's 101 different apps being used in every different classroom. And that's worrying for a number of reasons. First of all, teachers are often signing up for apps without really thinking about the wider ramifications of what's going on. And it's also really interesting in terms of how it increases inequalities, because you'll get some teachers that are just really tech savvy and downloading 101 apps, and then there are other teachers who are not doing anything at all. And so I'd much rather see a middle ground where technology use is a collective, maybe a group, and this is much more of a Scandinavian approach, but rather than every teacher feeling that they have to try and work out how to use technology to teach their own classes, it should be something that's talked about, it should be something that's shared, it should be something that maybe schools or municipalities can work out for themselves and kind of do on a communal collective basis. When we go into schools, the number one thing teachers want to know is, which app should I be using? And I have no idea which app, and it's going to be different for different people, but it should be something that's not just left to the individual person to worry about or to overdo either. And so technology in education is a strange thing. And the other thing that's happened in light of COVID, which is a little bit worrying, is that ed tech companies have worked out that they can actually probably make more money by selling direct to consumer, and the consumer being the parent. And so you're now seeing ed tech companies pivoting, and they're selling stuff to parents and families. And what that's going to mean is that you get technologies that are not designed for the classroom, but they're designed for the home. And you're going to get a whole other ecosystem of kids coming into schools, having used different apps outside of the school. So everything is messy, but not in a very good way. So I think we need to work out how to have a more collective and more democratic and just a more open approach to what technologies we want to use and what technologies we think are less useful.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to make these decisions for each subject and for the people that are actually going to teach, because one of the things we also see in Norway now is that a lot of these purchases, or a lot of these getting the technology part, is being done by people who negotiate directly with the edtech sellers, and then you make a choice for not just one class or one teacher, but for the whole school, sometimes for the whole municipality, and then you buy everything from one place, and then there will be a lot of choices that have been made for you that you cannot overdo, because it's really hard to change the instructional choices that have been made within an app, or even see what they are.
Well, absolutely. And even if you've chosen the app yourself, it's very unlikely that you're actually able to configure it in terms of the pedagogy that you want to be doing or anything like that. So the app is actually kind of pre-configured in a certain way. My concern is often in terms of pedagogy, in terms of teaching and learning, that no thought at all has been given to what the pedagogy is of an app or a piece of software. And in that absence, there's not much the teacher can do. You know, the app or the software or the platform is actually design, you know, is the pedagogical designer, the instructional design, and the teacher is very constrained. And so that's even if you've made the choice. And if you haven't even made the choice, then there's 2 degrees of separation.
Yeah, and I think also sometimes we overestimate how much information we get from these apps. For example, we have some apps that will promise the teacher, and I very much agree with you that the main audience is always either the school leader or the teacher, but never the student. So we have these apps promising now in Norway that, you know, the student can do 300 tasks, and then you can get you can push a button, and then it says that they have, for example, 82 correct across different subjects. But it actually gives you 0 information until you sit beside that student and watch them do every task and look at what kind of input they have given the computer. So I think I'm a bit worried about that aspect as well, that we might be overestimating how much information these technologies are able to give us.
Oh, the whole area of data and learning analytics and this idea of personalized learning through technology is really, really interesting. And I think with any information that I get from a computer about my students, I always think about what aspects of teaching and learning cannot be very easily quantified or actually not being measured. And so the data is so partial and often based on kind of proxies or inferences. You know, the amount of time you watch a video is used to how engaged you are. And you know, and every teacher watching this will know that engagement is a really kind of nuanced, qualitative thing. And so I haven't got a problem with using data to guide or maybe inform my teaching practice, but I would not want it to completely direct what I do, and I would not want to base my decisions solely on the data from a computer. It's just one piece of information. And actually being in the room and being with students and being with other teachers, it is often far more rich source of data and insight than anything a computer can ever tell you.
Yeah, for sure. And so I also have a question for you about this whole COVID pandemic period, where in Norway we were quite lucky in a sense because our digital infrastructure is very, very good. So compared to the rest of the world, I think we were well prepared in a sense to send everybody to the comfort of their own home, and then they have to stay there and do every schooling remotely. And so the Norwegian government did not change the ambition level. So we were supposed to do everything we normally would, but digitally, which is of course mission impossible, but that was the plan. And so I see that you have termed this whole period for emergency remote teaching, which I like a lot because it is an emergency situation and it's an unplanned situation. But do you think we have learned anything from the whole COVID thing that's good for technology in education? Are there any good things there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's also lots of bad things as well. I mean, one of the things that
you can
COVID
talk
did.
About the bad things too.
Well, yeah, I think I'll talk about everything. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about the emergency room, and the reason I called it emergency remote schooling, is it wasn't an indication of how technology could be used or perhaps should be used, because no one had planned it. So everybody's saying, oh, this is the evidence that technology doesn't work and we have to have it. That wasn't what we were doing here. And neither was it an example of how wonderful technology is either. It was just an emergency situation and people improvised and they got by. And I think the schooling, even in a country like Norway or Australia, was good enough. It wasn't great, and I wouldn't want to do it again. And if you look at the data, a lot of people didn't find it as easy or the same as before. A lot of people, you talked about going in the comfort of your own home. A lot of people's homes are not comfortable.
Right.
If you're in a household where there's domestic violence or there's also mental health issues, it's the worst place to be stuck. And we were locked down for over 150 days. So I don't think anyone would like to repeat it. But on the other hand, I think there were some really interesting things that came out of it technology-wise. As academics, I mean, I love the idea that I can talk to you on Zoom and not have to travel to Norway and all the rest of it. So that was an interesting thing. The idea that people have been tipped over into live video streaming. For me, the most interesting things were where teachers and students and families improvised with informal technologies. And so a lot of things we saw were teachers just deciding to appropriate WhatsApp, for example, and set up informal WhatsApp groups, or some students were using TikTok in really interesting ways. And so students and teachers were bringing in their own personal, intimate technologies that they use themselves for the classroom. And that was really, really interesting. There were some great uses of social media, some great uses of smartphones in terms of creating videos, and just the way that people use technologies to keep in contact, to maybe share things. And these informal uses, I think, were really interesting. And it would be great to kind of carry on some of those practices once we've gone back to the classroom. Now, in Australia, in Victoria, where I work, mobile phones are banned from schools. So we had this odd situation where for a year, people were doing really exciting things with mobile phones and social media. And now they're back in the classroom. They can't do any of it.
Oh.
So we should start these conversations. What were we doing differently during COVID that really was interesting or exciting or fun? And how can we possibly keep that going once we're back to normal?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be good. So the time goes really quickly. And so I have a final question for you. And it's a difficult one because you said that researchers shouldn't decide what teachers should do. But I'm going to push you on it anyway, because, I mean, if you were a principal working in a school somewhere and you were responsible for your teachers and the parents and the students, and then it was decided that your school has to implement one-to-one technology in a good way. What kind of choices would you make? What do you think would be important to think about? That's your final question today.
I would try and make it a site of conversation. I would want to talk with people and just also see what people actually wanted to do. The worst thing you can do is impose a kind of top-down model of how you think it could work. And try and keep things as loose and open as possible. So the idea of saying everybody must buy a Chromebook or everybody must buy an iPad seems to be a little bit old-fashioned. So the idea of having a kind of more open approach to devices, I would certainly be worried about the digital divide and want to have some form of either loaning people or giving people devices rather than actually kind of making them all buy it or making the school buy it. So some form of making the devices shared. And again, communal resources. And personally, I'm really interested in this idea of open source software and free, and software that is not proprietary. So even just things like not using Zoom, but using Jitsi, for example, or there are all sorts of open source alternatives that can be used. And then the school has more control and more configuration. So making it as open and as loose as possible would be good. But then also just thinking through some of the practical issues. We've done research on one-to-one schools, and one of the big problems that lots of schools have are simple things like power, allowing students to charge up their devices during the day. And so some schools had completely banned students from charging up their devices, which was crazy. So I guess let 100 flowers bloom, keep things open, don't be too prescriptive, think about disadvantage and try not to disadvantage anybody through, and keep this conversation going and be prepared to change things. I think having a device is a wonderful thing. And the other thing as well is just, as well as teacher professional learning, which is very important, it's probably quite good to have students, not training students, but at least preparing students to actually learn with the device, because lots of students have no idea how to learn well with devices, even though we think they're digital natives. Doesn't mean to say they can learn well, but also get parents and carers and families involved as well. And again, COVID was a good lesson for that. We could see how parents, teachers can work together to support technology-based learning. So the less one size fits all, the better.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And one other thing I would love to say is just, I know this session is being sponsored by a teaching union. And I think technology-based education is a really important issue for unions and union members to be talking about, both in terms of teaching and learning, but education and technology is also about work, and it's a labor issue and it's a workplace issue. And there are lots of things I think that unions can do to actually make technology work for teachers and to make sure that technology doesn't disadvantage teachers. So yeah, all power to the union.
Thank you so much, both of you, for a highly interesting half an hour, and you have undoubtedly given us food for thoughts and some interesting new perspectives about keeping it messy in a good way, maybe. Thank you both, Neil Selwyn and Marte Blikstad-Balas, for your time and knowledge. Thank you to all of you who followed this session from Union of Education Norway. Tusen takk fra oss fra Utdanningsforbundet. Ha det bra.